This week, to be closer to China, the United States and China have begun a trade war with threats and counter-threats to escalate and unintended consequences that benefit no one. What's the nature of the U.S.-China trade war?
The conflict is really much more about innovation, technology, the future of both countries and the role they'll play in shaping their own destinies and in the global economic framework.
What underlies U.S. actions? President Trump certainly has had long-standing concerns about China, focusing on trade deficits. But the sudden prominence of Peter Navarro, an anti-China crusader, as director of the new White House National Trade Council, has injected a zealous stridency into U.S. positions towards China. What are Navarro's beliefs? How do Navarro's theories apply to the real world?
纳瓦罗只是捡了一部分的数据，一个片面的东西来迷惑公众，来混淆视听。
How will the trade war evolve?
但是归根到底还在特朗普本人，因为他是个非常强势的总统，他是个大 boss 嘛，对吧？他来主导，他来做决定。
This week, be closer to China. The United States and China have begun a trade war with threats to escalate and unintended consequences that benefit no one. The U.S. initiates, China responds in kind, the U.S. intensifies, China hits back proportionally. What to do? The first step in ending the trade war is for each side, the U.S. and China, to understand thoroughly the other side's arguments and ways of thinking, as well as its positions and lists of demands. What underlies U.S. actions? President Trump certainly has had long-standing concerns about China, focusing on trade deficits. In contrast, most American analysts and policymakers target more open markets, stricter intellectual property protection, industrial espionage, tech transfers in joint ventures, and government support for industrial policies, especially emerging technologies. But the sudden prominence of Peter Navarro, an anti-China crusader, as director of the new White House National Trade Council, has injected a zealous stridency into the U.S. position towards China, together with his theories. Though the vast majority of mainstream economists and recognized China experts dismiss Navarro's unnuanced theories as both simplistic and dangerous, because Trump takes them seriously, so must we. So, what is Navarro's academic belief? How does Navarro's theory apply to the real world about trade deficits, trade relations, the efficacy of tariffs, manufacturing jobs, U.S. national security, China's ambitions, China's strategies? Though Navarro won't be, we will be closer to China. On July 6, 2018, U.S. President Donald Trump levied tariffs on $34 billion worth of Chinese goods, and China responded with similar-sized tariffs on U.S. products. And with several rounds of battling tariffs and not-so-veiled threats, the burgeoning trade war between the world's two largest economies has been apparently, inexorably escalating. The Trump administration said the tariffs were necessary to protect U.S. national security and the intellectual property of American businesses and to help reduce the U.S. trade deficit with China. Peter Navarro, the director of the newly established White House National Trade Council, is one of the core figures behind Trump's current trade policy. Trump once said about Navarro, "I read one of Peter's books on America's trade problems years ago and was impressed by the clarity of his arguments and thoroughness of his research," adding, "He has presciently documented the harms inflicted by globalism on American workers and laid out a path forward to restore our middle class." Navarro argues that China violates fair trade by illegal export subsidies and currency manipulation, effectively flooding the U.S. markets and making it virtually impossible for American companies to compete. It is a critique of global capitalism, including foreign labor practices and lack of environmental protection. Currency manipulation and subsidies are listed as reasons that American companies cannot compete because they're not competing with Chinese companies, they're competing with the Chinese government. However, Navarro's views are well outside the mainstream of economic thought. According to an article in Bloomberg Businessweek in 2017, Navarro is far more skeptical of free trade than most of his economic peers, for whom free trade is a foundational principle. Truly disappointing, wrote Harvard economist Gregory Mankiw, who was President George W. Bush's chief economic advisor, of a Trump campaign white paper that Navarro co-wrote. Trade imbalances, trade deficits from the American point of view don't occur in a vacuum. They relate in part to differences between savings and consumption rates in different countries, where in the U.S. Savings rates are lower and consumption is higher. Yet Navarro's theories seem to ignore or even dismiss such analysis. What's your view?
Well, I don't think it's really a theory. I think it's more of a, he wrote a book before he came to Washington and then produced a movie called Death by China. It's more of a political polemic that is directed at holding China responsible for all that ails America. The president is very sympathetic to that, was as a business person, a candidate, and initially as president seemed much more temperate in his approach to China, but has since been won over by the Navarro Lighthizer mantra that China is responsible for all that ails America and that which is preventing America from being great again. So the Trump administration is on the attack, and the tariffs and promise of more to come fits the Navarro script to a T. And the U.S. has a major series of bilateral imbalances, mainly because of a lack of domestic savings and a big imbalance between saving and investment. And when countries don't have enough saving to cover their investment, they import surplus savings from abroad and run large multilateral trade imbalances with many countries, and China is one of those many countries.
Peter Navarro hardly has any academic achievements. Even though he got his doctoral degree in economics from Harvard, the issues that he is actually focusing on aren't real economic issues. If you look at his studies, you will realize that essentially they are not about real economics, and the papers he writes are quite marginalized, not recognized by the mainstream academia in economics. Paul Krugman, a renowned international trade expert and Nobel laureate, once wrote in a New York Times editorial that Navarro had no understanding of international trade at all. Worse still, he thought that he did, so his pieces are not serious academic or policy research. I think his book and documentary were just like a tabloid, or to exaggerate and create a sensation, to grab your attention with malicious intentions.
Navarro's documentary, Death by China, claims that China is the greatest threat to the American way of life. You reviewed the documentary and called it a tabloid-like screenplay. Why did you say that?
Well, it's sort of scandalous in the charges that it levels, and it really brings together a lot of circumstantial evidence that has very little to do with the accusations that Navarro makes about China threatening the very future of the American way of life. Cites plant closings and job losses that many would attribute to the broad forces of globalization that have little or nothing to do with China. For example, in 1952, the manufacturing sector accounted for about a little less than 35% of total jobs in the United States. That share is now down to about 8.5%. In the Navarro book, Death by China, he says it's all because of China. China didn't join the WTO until late 2001. By that time, that share was already down to about 12.5%. And you want to blame China for the carnage that the president seems to believe is made in China, created by the so-called death in China mantra of Navarro. And China is certainly part of the globalization process, but by no means the sole factor responsible for this outcome.
The unemployment rate in the U.S. is currently about 4%, which in economics is referred to as full employment. Waging a trade war in these circumstances is far from logical. Moreover, as full employment exists before the trade war, it means the impact of trade upon employment in America must be very limited. So firstly, starting a trade war with full employment wouldn't provide America with any benefits or advantages. Secondly, America's employment rate problem indicates a structural shift. That is, the employment rate for blue-collar workers is continuously falling, while the rate for other sectors is on the rise. For instance, the employment rates for the service sectors, the knowledge industry, in Silicon Valley, and so on, are continuously rising. America is undergoing a restructuring of its employment sectors. If the laid-off blue-collar workers in America fail to regain employment, it means the country lacks support programs for these low-skilled workers to get reemployed. These issues have nothing to do with international trade. They are related to U.S. domestic policies. There are few guarantees about employment in America in the long run, and this is a hard lesson the American government should learn and bear in mind long term. From a global perspective, if we view the issue with the American economy within the framework of the global economy, we will realize that a falling employment rate for blue-collar workers is a universal phenomenon. Even in China, that is the case. For instance, we just saw a World Bank report that compares statistics. The number of blue-collar workers has been falling across all sectors.
Not all U.S. imports from China are wholly Chinese. A large part of them are so-called intermediate goods, parts made in other countries that are assembled in China and then shipped back for sale. Consider the iPhone 10. Of the $1,000 retail price, roughly $370 represents the cost of making each phone, including parts, especially display and memory chips, and assembly, according to HIS Market. But the value the Chinese contract manufacturer with the Chinese workers adds by assembling these parts represents only between 3 and 6% of the iPhone's retail price. However, when the assembled phone is shipped to Apple, U.S. official trade data counts nearly the full $370 cost as part of China's trade deficit with the U.S., inflating the size of the U.S. trade deficit, even though the large majority of the value was added by suppliers in other countries. Global supply chains make U.S. trade figures misleading because they show where products are imported from, not who benefits from the trade. Navarro's theories focus on the economic activities of China versus the United States. What's your response?
So some
of the current international statistical methods and international trade rules do not match the global manufacturing reality. I think the American government fails to offer the public a clear explanation. It is quite radical and irresponsible to casually quote a case, blame China for a $370 billion trade surplus, and provoke a trade war. Many people are arguing that as the U.S. fights against China, it is also hurting itself. The whole value chain is fully integrated. It is almost impossible to identify one thing that is purely China-made. It is very irrational to wage the trade war in the world with more converged interests and full integration. These issues simply cannot be measured with the simple parameter of trade deficit. The Trump administration, mainly stirred up by Peter Navarro, the White House trade advisor, has barked up the wrong tree, with publicity aimed at the American people only based on limited information and a highly generalized understanding of the trade deficit. The overall landscape of the economy has been neglected, and there are some grave mistakes in this understanding of the issue. This also indicates that Navarro himself, as an economist, does not have the capability to construct an overall analysis at the macro level. His theory barely holds water. What is the general background and rationale? To me, it is very irresponsible behavior if he tries to wage a trade war between China and America because of some minor problems.
Both Section 301 and Navarro's theories state that China's investment policy is to use state-owned enterprises backed by state funds to overwhelm small American startup companies and medium-sized technology companies, the crown jewels, so that China will dominate the most important technologies of the future. What's your take?
No, I mean, China's not interested in taking over the United States. China is, in its technology businesses, most of its efforts are actually being led by very powerful, dynamic, rapidly growing, privately held or market-based enterprises in China that are not owned by the state. You know, Baidu, Tencent, JD.com, Alibaba, you know, these are not state-owned enterprises. These are large, successful, dynamic, Chinese, privately held or publicly listed companies.
But subsidies are not uncommon in America either. Agriculture receives the biggest amount of subsidy of all the sectors in America. U.S. agriculture is heavily subsidized by the government. Boeing planes, too. Airbus of Europe is also the same. Therefore, in regards to subsidies, there are no substantial differences between China and America. What differs is only the scale, the quantity.
Navarro's theories and opinions were also embodied in the white paper issued by the White House Office of Trade and Manufacturing Policy entitled, "How China's Economic Aggression Threatens the Technologies and Intellectual Properties of the United States and the World." The document, released in June 2018, relying heavily on Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, accuses China of forced technology transfer, currency manipulation, and cyber espionage, and criticizes China's going-out strategies of international business. The report has been accepted as foundational evidence to provide the Trump administration with the authority to support tariffs and other punitive measures against those countries assumed to be harming U.S. interests. Stephen Roach has a different view. The former chairman of Morgan Stanley Asia and chief economist at Morgan Stanley, now at Yale University, Roach was instrumental in establishing a joint venture between Morgan Stanley and China Construction Bank to build China's first and most successful domestic investment bank, CICC, China International Capital Corporation. During his 15-year experience in the JV, Roach said Morgan Stanley was never forced to turn over anything. All decisions were business decisions, and the cooperation delivered excellent returns to Morgan Stanley, to their shareholders, and to China. Navarro's theories as what seems to be part of the basis for American trade policy today, especially towards China, has been expressed in a white paper that the White House Trade Manufacturing Office has issued based on the so-called Section 301. And the significant charge there is that China is making an all-out effort to steal the crown jewels of American technology by all means necessary, illegal and immoral, whatever it takes. Do you think this charge is justified?
I think, you know, there are three elements of that white paper or report that I think are dubious, very dubious in terms of merits, substance, and analytics. The first one is this forced technology transfer through joint ventures, which I think is really wide of the mark based on the construct of joint ventures, which are legally binding, commercially negotiated frameworks that most countries use, developing countries use, to partner with foreign investors. And again, my experience as a senior executive at a joint venture is that these are arrangements where two partners work together to build a business, and they share a lot, including proprietary technologies to do that. The second aspect of the USTR allegations is in the area of cyber hacking. This has been serious. There's no question about it. There have been some violations that the Chinese have been cited for. And in 2015, President Obama presented President Xi Jinping with evidence of these cyber hacking allegations at the so-called Sunnyland Summit. And the two signed a cyber hacking accord. Since then, the activity has been sharply reduced, not eliminated, so there's still some issues that need to be addressed. But the USTR report of March really presents evidence that predates the Sunnyland Summit. And finally, there's this so-called going out strategy, the idea that China is gobbling up America's crown jewels. A comprehensive assessment and tabulation of China's outward bound M&A activity in the technology area says that the deal flow for outbound M&A and technology has been significantly smaller than, say, the deal flow of Chinese property investments in the United States. And I guess related to this going out strategy is the so-called notion of industrial policy, the Made in China 2025, the AI plan for Chinese global dominance in artificial intelligence by 2030. America seems aghast that China would aspire to those types of objectives and marshal the full force of the government to support industrial policy. And yet that's the ultimate in hypocrisy for the United States to have that claim.
The trade war, reflecting Navarro's perspective, affects the entire world. The IMF has warned that the rising trade tensions between the United States and the rest of the world could cost the global economy $430 billion, with the U.S. especially vulnerable to an escalating tariff war. Russia said it began imposing additional import tariffs of 25 to 40% for a range of U.S. products in retaliation to U.S. additional tariffs of 25% on steel and 10% on aluminum. In addition, Russia has filed the case with the World Trade Organization. The complaint is the seventh initiated by a WTO member against Trump's steel and aluminum duties, following cases brought by China, India, the European Union, Canada, Mexico, and Norway. However, as of July 2018, the U.S. has blocked the WTO's appointment of new judges. Currently, only 4 judges remain of the former 7 permanent judges. Given the ongoing trade war, what will happen to the world trade system and its impact is still hard to discern. What's your view of Navarro's theories of economics and trade? If they are implemented and continue to be implemented, what are the implications for China and the U.S.?
It's a negative for both of us. The one thing about China, though, is that China has already moved to change the structure of its economy. Its export share, which 10 years ago was above 35%, is now less than 20% of its GDP. And so it's not as vulnerable to an external shock as would have been the case 10 years ago. China's got plenty of sort of fiscal space to expand its budget deficit, unlike the U.S. with interest rates that are extraordinarily low now, a little bit above zero. China's got much more to play with on monetary policy and its currency, which has run way up over the last 10 years. There's plenty of leeway, and it has been recently going down. So China's got a lot of policy levers that the U.S., with its shortfall of savings, its big budget deficits, and monetary policy, which is getting policy interest rates close to zero, doesn't have. So there's a lot of optionality that China has in addressing these issues that the United States does not have.
If the U.S.-China trade war continues, what are the implications for the world? World trade, world economic development? What can we say about the future if this trade war doesn't end?
It is more of an industrial problem, maybe even with political purposes. Therefore, it will jeopardize our relationship of common prosperity long term and has deviated from our traditional practice of sitting down for negotiations to resolve disputes. It imposes long-term damage on both countries, and the U.S. is urged to reconsider. As for global consequences, it seems that America is playing a game. It is engaged in cooperation with the European Union, Japan, NAFTA, and countries in North America in attempts to create a free trade zone. But it's widely known that any trade negotiations, particularly those between more evenly matched parties, are extremely difficult. The U.S. and many European countries, for example, are expert policymakers. Negotiations between countries cannot happen overnight. There will be several rounds of game playing which will be very time-consuming. The TPP and TTIP discussion, which began during the Obama administration, has already lasted years. More than a dozen years have been spent on the TPP. In such circumstances, whether Trump can achieve his goal within his term is also open to question. Even if he does achieve it, then we will all be wondering whether the existing international trade pattern is coming to an end. Would this be a positive trend? As we have mentioned, trade is based on mutual benefits and comparative advantages. If a developed country initiates a trade zone on its own, would it really result in the end of importing cheap textiles from developing countries? Would that maximize the profitability of trade if Europe imports goods from America and vice versa? Could consumers be granted the best prices in that case? I think U.S. companies all have their own opinion on whether the production line should be in China, in Vietnam, or in France.
I find scant intellectual challenge in defeating Peter Navarro's one-dimensional trade economics or his scare caricatures of China. Had Donald Trump not been elected president, Navarro's theories and persona would have never made a ripple. But Trump is president, and for years, Trump's own native instincts have resonated with Navarro's fact-shy, emotional-loaded bashing of China. Navarro's prescriptions won't work. China cannot back down, and the U.S. and China are not a closed system the rest of the world would compensate. Ironically, if Navarro's tariffs would work, bringing back U.S. manufacturing jobs, in the long run, the U.S. would be worse off, having sacrificed growing industries of the future, such as alternative energy and AI, to protect, for a while, shrinking industries of the past. But I shall not fall into the logical trap of the straw man fallacy by pretending to believe that defeating Navarro's weak arguments, or for that matter Trump's, will undermine the new U.S. strategy of getting tougher with China. The target categories are clear. In some, China has made real progress. In all, China needs to do more. Many Chinese economists argue that reform-minded measures that the U.S. would recognize, especially in more rapidly opening markets and protecting IP, and even in reducing government support for industrial policies, would in fact be in China's own best economic interests. There is nicely natural alignment between China's internal reform and external compromise, if only each side would see it and be closer to China.